Yeah, thanks, Wayne. Ngara Jerp Janang Lenok, Lenok Janang and Ngara Mort Buja, Wajak Buja, Mam and Janang Lenok, Lenok Wangin and Karajan Wangin, Browan Lenok Wort Kolonok Wangin and Ngarin Wangin, Kev Wangin, Mam and Janang Lenok Kaiwa. Lenok Wort Kolonok Kalak, Lenok Buja Lenok Mort, Mam and Janang Lenok. So may the good spirit be with us. This is called the Wajak section of the Nyungar language group. I ask the good spirit to guide us through our presentations, not only in the official capacity in here with the discussions, but also when we're sharing food and drink and sharing time with each other. We're doing something all of our ancestors have been doing for thousands of years. I also ask the good spirit to take each and every one of you safely home to your families when this presentation is over. Unfortunately, I can't stay. I've got another appointment, but any time there's events like this with the unions, I'm a firm supporter. I had this discussion earlier with Wayne and a couple of other colleagues around, saying that back in the 60s when I was a young man, started into the political arena for rights and equity for Aboriginal people. There's only two groups of people that stood by us at that stage, and that was the unions and the university students. So as a person now, at my age, I never ever forget that. So every time you hear the same speeches, whether it's a May Day march or a union gathering, a conference, that I will never get sick of delivering it, and I hope you never get sick of hearing it. May the good spirit be with us.
Now, my name is Wayne Wood and I am the branch secretary of the Australian Services Union. To some people, I would be the first Aboriginal branch secretary in the country in 200 years of unionism. I don't know if that's true, and I don't want to be disrespectful to those people that have came before me. In the same way that I say we're gathered here today, meeting on traditional land, and we like to acknowledge those people, acknowledge the Aboriginal tribe, the Noongar people, and also that we would pay our respects to elders both past and present. And we do that simply when Aboriginal people meet. We talk about our heritage and where we come from, and that's one way we can connect. But it's difficult for a lot of us because I guess we've been suppressed for a long time, and I guess assimilation has taken its toll. My grandmother was stolen from her country. She was stolen from her family, and she was a Beagle Bay person. But she was taken from a tribe, a Wariora tribe in Fitzroy River, but she grew up at Beagle Bay Mission. And there was a lot of children that went through that mission, some 1,000 children that were taken away from their family. And over the years, it's been difficult. Now, I was born in the early 60s, and the truth of the matter is I can't remember much of what life was like before 1967, but I understand the significance of what we're here to celebrate today, and that is the referendum of 1967, the 50th anniversary. Now that is a long time. I just want you to think about what it means, because the truth of the matter is, if we look around the room today, there are a number of Indigenous people that are here, and welcome, thanks for coming. But if we were to count people in this room and say, well, we've got about 90 people here, that would be one thing. But to count 90 people and to say, well, there's only 70 people here, how do you think that makes that 20 feel? And that's the way I've felt for a long time. It was only one small thing. It was about counting people, no longer flora and fauna. These were real people, and they needed to be counted. We count lots of things. Farmers count cattle and sheep, but the government didn't count Aboriginal people, and that is just wrong. And in 1967, Australia spoke as a nation, and it wasn't much. It was just simple acknowledgement to count people, but it's a big thing and it's led a long way. Now, back in 1967, my mother worked as a cleaner at Royal Perth Hospital, and on the way home, she was arrested because in 1967, Aboriginal people needed the permit to be in Perth. It was bad. We had curfew on Aboriginal people. If you went to Roban, which was actually a fairly big town back then, you'll find that if people weren't back at the mission by 6 o'clock, then they were arrested on site. So just think about what type of a country we could have had if we didn't go for change. And we did vote. We did change what, how people saw Aboriginal people, how they saw the owners of the land then, and we've come a long way. Today there are lawyers and doctors. We just had one speak. He has a doctorate. We've also got branch secretary. There's actually three of us. There's three of us in Australia at the moment. Matthew Mayer from the MUA in Darwin, and Adam Kerslake, who is the branch secretary for Professionals Australia. But we've been in the union movement a long time. And we see what happens when Aboriginal people fight for their rights. Last year we celebrated, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Wave Hill Walk-Off. And that was a powerful statement by a group of Aboriginal people that probably weren't even in the union to begin with. But they got a lot of help from unions. And there was a lot of rallying for their support. And that dispute went on a long time. And the truth of the matter is it resulted in land rights for Aboriginal people. That's where these things start. We've got a long way to go and a lot of things to do. It's been a difficult journey for lots of Indigenous people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders across this nation, and we have a long way to go. I'm yet to meet or walk into a power station where I see Aboriginal power station controllers. I'm yet to look around Western Power and see Aboriginal apprentices, where I can see electricians, people that simply want what all of us want, a career path, a future. That is all we've ever really wanted. And we did a workshop in 2011 in Darwin with a group of Aboriginal people, and surprise, surprise, all they said they wanted in the end was a future. They wanted a working career, and they wanted somewhere where they could go with dignity and earn some money. And if you walk around the streets of Darwin, Port Hedland, Roban and lots of places now, those people don't have that. So we've still got a lot to do, but we have come a long way. Look, our guest speaker tonight is Ben Wyatt, MLA, elected to Parliament for Vic Park and was elected in a by-election in March 2006. His ministerial appointments are Treasury, Minister of Finance, Energy and Aboriginal Affairs. And he has been in that position since Labor Party won the election in 2017. It seems like a long time ago. And so he's been appointed since the 17th of March. He has an impressive resume, and I don't wish to embarrass Ben, but he attended UWA, graduating with arts and law in 1997. Undertook university training as an officer in the Australian Army Reserves at the Royal Military College. Graduated with a commission in 1996. In 2000, was a recipient of a scholarship and a master's at the London School of Economics and Political Science. In 2002, continues a career in law, both in private practice and at the WA Director of Public Prosecutions before being elected to Parliament. And if I may invite Ben to come up to the podium to speak. Ben is the first Treasurer of Aboriginality in any state in this country, the first time in our political in our political history. So please welcome Ben to the stage.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Wayne, for the introduction, to Richard for the welcome to country. Can I also acknowledge the traditional owners? Can I acknowledge Steve McCartney and Meredith Hammett from UnionsWA, all the union secretaries and organisers and workers who are here tonight, to my parliamentary colleagues, David Michael, who just gave his first speech to Parliament the other week, Bill Johnson, Stephen Dawson, my ministerial colleagues. It's indeed an honour to be here. It feels as though, you're right, it feels as though it was quite long ago we were elected, Wayne. Longer than the couple of months it has been. But of all those portfolios that I have, the one that I was absolutely determined to keep was Aboriginal Affairs, because I see it now, particularly with the majority that we have in the lower house, as a real opportunity to make some decisions, to get some things done that have been talked about for a long period of time in Western Australia. And I'll probably conclude my comments with some comments around Aboriginal Affairs in the new McGowan Labor government. But it is quite a time to be speaking to you all tonight in the immediate fallout of the Uluru Statement. It is a really important, stark, audacious time in Aboriginal politics, actually. It's not just the right wrongs, the 1967 referendum anniversary that we celebrate this year. It's of course 20 years since the Bringing Them Home report was tabled in the federal parliament, a report that had a big impact on my father and on his life and on my family's life, but also 25 years since the Mabo decision by the High Court. And now, 50 years after the 1967 referendum, we're now, I think, finally have the Aboriginal view in respect of what has been a long conversation around constitutional amendment, whether you call that recognition, whether you call it a new body. We now have an Aboriginal position. And what makes me incredibly proud about that position is that the debate around the models, around the minimalist versus the constitutionally bold options, has finally now been settled in respect of what is the Aboriginal view. And that has been a long time coming. There's been many conversations. Like every other part of Australia, it's not unified, but there is a position. And I think that has thrown at the mainstream political parties a real challenge. And I, for one, am really pleased with that challenge, because it says, and I think quite rightly, that this decision to be made by Australians, when it is to be made, and the question to be put to Australians, is only likely going to happen once in my lifetime. And so Aboriginal Australia said, well, let's make it a proper decision. Sometimes that should happen in the chamber, just as I start warming up. But the key being is that it's a question and a decision that Aboriginal Australia have said, well, let's make it one that counts. Because when we go back to 1967, of course, such a significant referendum that had such an overwhelming response from Australia, yet 9 years later, despite that, we still had events like Nookanbar, where whilst Aboriginal people were counted, as Wayne pointed out, Aboriginal people were still very much not part of the mainstream political process, not really considered the cultural and heritage and importance of traditional connection to country, still nearly a decade later, was fundamentally ignored in respect of the march of development. And the history of Aboriginal Australia, of course, isn't one of being ignored. Indeed, Aboriginal Australia, great attention has been paid to Aboriginal Australia, certainly since the time Stirling sailed up the Derbarl Yerrigan. Great attention has been paid. Many pieces of legislation have been passed. Our constitution, our state constitution, that just last year at the instigation of Josie Farrer, the member for Kimberley, finally removed some of the more offensive parts of our state constitution, which of course we could do without referendum, thankfully. But it has always been very much cajoling controlling, humiliating Aboriginal people. When Sterling arrived, those initial debates that took place between the newly formed Parliament here in Western Australia and Westminster, with Chamberlain as Colonial Secretary, highlight the point very clearly in reams of correspondence that Forrest, Lord Forrest of Bunbury, as he was to become, whilst the initial architect, if you like, of the Aborigines Protection Board, once became Premier, was very keen to see its removal, because the board at the time was in charge of a constitutionally enshrined flow of money that was to be spent for the benefit of the natives. Now, once Forrest became Premier, he saw that as a problem, because he saw that as, well, we are a parliament, we should be trusted with the responsibility of looking after our Aboriginal people. Now, the correspondence between him and Chamberlain in Westminster highlight the point that Chamberlain was indeed incredibly nervous about handing over control of Aboriginal people to the local parliament, the local government here in Western Australia. Westminster had no faith whatsoever that the local parliament would actually take any care or consideration of the natives at the time. And that went on for quite a period of time until eventually, of course, Forrest, after numerous visits to the United Kingdom, convinced Westminster to accept the amendment to the Constitution, the state constitution, that saw the Protection Board effectively removed, but significantly that flow, that constitutionally enshrined flow of revenue, also removed from the Constitution. And the echoes of that still permeate debate today around the role and sovereignty of Aboriginal people in Western Australia. But what that also led into was the first piece of legislation that sought to validate what Westminster had done, and that's, of course, the Aborigines Act of 1905. Now, that act rampaged its way through history of Aboriginal Australia, Aboriginal Western Australia, really through to the date of the referendum. Because whilst there were a range of amendments and changes to the legislation, the core activities that that Act allowed, that is the control of Aboriginal people, fundamentally did not change for the better part of 70 years. Just this week, actually last week, on Friday, Simone McGurk, in her capacity as Minister for Child Protection, Community Services and Family and Domestic Violence, handed over to me, if you like, my department, just over 21,000 files from the various permutations of the old Office of Native Welfare, etc., that had been taken a while to happen. Other states have been very good at getting all these files into one location and making them accessible to Aboriginal people. That was finally handed over just on Friday, just over 21,000 files, including the file of my father, which I had not seen, and it was presented to me on Friday. When you look through that file and I compare that to the file of my grandmother, who was very much all her life controlled by the bureaucracy, her file is very, very large. My father's not so large. What is clear is, and quite extraordinary, is the extent to which the government of the day went to controlling every aspect of the life of Aboriginal people. In fact, I doubt government today would have the capacity to do what governments did to Aboriginal people during that time, to the point where my grandmother was pregnant with my father. The planning for the birth, the planning for my father, how long he would stay with his mother before he would then be transferred to Sister Kate's, which ultimately he was, and then ultimately through to Castledare and Clontarf, and he didn't see his mother again until well into his 40s. The control was just quite extraordinary. And it wasn't in terms of the care and consideration, but it was a deliberate attempt to ensure that the Aboriginal practice of country, the heritage, the significance of that long connection to country was removed. And which is why the Uluru Statement for me is something that is so important, and I ideally hope the federal Parliament and national leaders are able to take a considered, mature approach, not driven by the fear of defeat at a referendum, but by the opportunities it presents. At Noonkanbah, and I look around this room, people were very familiar with Noonkanbah. The Trades and Labour Council stood with the Aboriginal community very much side by side. Richard Wally made this point. It was the Trades and Labour Council that really elevated the Noonkanbah dispute to the national level of prominence it became. And this is, for those who, it's a very, Steve Hawke's book, Noonkanbah, you've no doubt, those who follow this are familiar with it. I just want to read a motion that was passed at the Trades and Labour Council. And this was at a meeting, a huge meeting, attended by over 400 people. Following addresses from Peter Dowding and Ivan McPhee, a full meeting of 120 delegates of the TLC formally supported an earlier decision of a meeting of key unions, resolving that, and I quote, "In these circumstances, we believe that we should respond to the request for support from the Noonkanbah community by requesting the ACTU to ask the federal government to use its constitutional power to take the matter out of the hands of the court government and protect the sacred areas as defined in the museum study as a matter of urgency. Requesting the ACTU to object direct to AMAX's head office in Australia and through the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions to its international head office. Imposing a TLC-sponsored ban on the movement of equipment needed for the project and the activities of AMAX in Western Australia to be lifted when advised by the Noonkanbah community that discussions have concluded to their satisfaction." That was 1976. 1976. And yet today in 2017 we still have what will become, I dare say, a fierce debate about whether laws passed by the federal parliament should at the very least be presented to Aboriginal people for comment in a non-binding way. And that's the Aboriginal people have been very careful with what they've proposed at Uluru. They know the formidable objections, not just in the Constitution, but to the constitutionally conservative people of Australia. And they've done it in a way, I think, that is both audacious but clever, to make it very difficult, I think, for a rational argument to object. But in 1976, the TLC, through the key unions, were making the point that we will stand with Aboriginal people at Noonkanbah. We will represent them not just at the national level but at the international level, and we will change our position only on the advice of the people of Noonkanbah. Highlight the point that for many decades, and many decades before 1976 at Noonkanbah, it was the unions that recognised that you can't have, in a country like Australia, which for a long time has been a wealthy country, its First Peoples living in squalor and ignored by the mainstream political process. It always has been that way and will continue to be that way. And I dare say now with the Uluru statement, you will see the unions take on another leadership role in hopefully seeing that, at the very least, presented to our political leaders in Canberra for a rational debate without fear or rancour. Because already it is very easy to whip the winds of fear to defeat any amendments around the Constitution. Coming back to my father, his life, the life of his close friends Rob Riley, who has a prominent role to play in this story of Noonkanbah, a prominent Western Australian who, through his tireless advocacy, again with the support of trade unionists, saw not a royal commission, but the review and the report that led to the Bringing Them Home report 20 years ago, tabled in the Parliament in the federal Parliament just last week. A report that, by and large, I think took every ounce of energy, certainly of Rob Riley. A report that, to this day, when we handed over the files from Simone McGurk's department to my department into a central location for Aboriginal people to access, actually started with the Bringing Them Home report recommendations 20 years previously. that report continues to guide policy, slowly, but continues to guide policy. And moving all that through to where, on election day this year, where over the last 2 years, the debate around the Aboriginal Heritage Act and the Aboriginal Affairs Planning Authority Act had, I think, skewed into a place where I would have preferred the 1972 original legislation, heritage legislation, than the proposal in the Green Paper put out by the government, where everybody, Aboriginal people, rep bodies, government agencies, industry, everybody was unanimous in their frustration with the Heritage Act. Old, cumbersome, poorly resourced by consecutive governments, disrespectful to heritage locations, a piece of legislation not designed to protect, but to allow the minister of the day to ensure that sites can be destroyed, that the government, 2016 at the time, 15 at the time, when that draft piece of legislation, the government in 2015 could come to the conclusion that the way to fix it was to remove the involvement of Aboriginal people in the heritage process. And when I looked at that, I thought, well, there are more protections in the 1972 original Act for Aboriginal people than the 2015 proposal. Highlights that there still are challenges to be faced. And one of the commitments we made was to ensure that we revisit that process around heritage protection, and which we'll do. And the other commitment we made was in respect to the Aboriginal Affairs Planning Authority Act. The Act that passed the state parliament before I was born, that is the Act that establishes the Department for Aboriginal Affairs, an Act that is well past its useful life. When you look through the second reading debates that accompany that bill, it's not pretty reading for Aboriginal people. So it's time to update that legislation again, which is something that we'll do. Finally, the commitment that we made around the Lands Trust estate. The Lands Trust estate was created out of the Aboriginal Affairs Planning Authority Act. About 11% of Western Australia is held in the Lands Trust on behalf of and for Aboriginal people. It is a piece of it is a hugely missed opportunity for Aboriginal people to take charge of their lives. 12,000 Aboriginal people live on ALT land where the tenure is uncertain. There is no requirement for state to service ALT land, and which allowed, because of that uncertainty of tenure, allowed the former Premier to say, we will close those communities. The only reason that Premier could say that was because he could. There's no security of tenure whatsoever for those 12,000 Aboriginal people who live on ALT land, despite the fact that many of those people have lived there now for a long period of time because of previous decisions of state government. Wayne referred to your mum ended up at Beagle Bay?
Yeah, my grandmother.
Your grandmother. When you look around the movement of Aboriginal people, primarily with the missions, so many people were moved from their traditional country to mission locations that are now reserves, ALT land, and Josie Farah has a story very similar to this, to country that's not theirs. And now, as they untangle the difficulties of native title claims, the country that they've spent 40, 50 years on, it is extraordinarily difficult. That is why if there's one thing we can get through a parliament with a large Labor majority in the lower house, it would be to try and get some tenure reform, to provide some security for Aboriginal people, but also to allow the transfer, the divestment of that ALT land, some of it, I'm not naive, it's very difficult to suddenly move 11% of Western Australia, but that land that can be divested to Aboriginal groups and people to be divested for the opportunities that they create. The ALT has freehold land in regional centres. For the life of me, I don't know why. And now, just a final point I'll make around native title, because all these stories and struggles of Aboriginal people really, I guess, culminated in that famous High Court decision brought by Eddie Mabo. The connection to country for Aboriginal people is what defines Aboriginal people. It is, you ask any Aboriginal person, the first question will be, where are you from? Where's your country? Who's your mum? It's always a linear progression back. Where is your country? And to where do you belong? The Native Title Act, passed in great hope, and I still think can have the capacity to deliver for Aboriginal people, has seen now a movement, primarily from Aboriginal people, because Aboriginal people are very good at dealing with the constraints of legislation, very good at it, to create opportunities for not just regaining country. And you've seen, for example, 80% of the Kimberley now recognised traditional owner, recognised native title. Very, very good at providing Aboriginal people with that recognition and connection, often through very difficult litigation, but providing Aboriginal people with that certainty around their identity and cultural connections to country, that Aboriginal people say, well, we didn't need it, we knew where we're from, we know who our parents are, but in terms of the piece of legislation that passes our parliament to give those legal rights is something that I am very proud of. And Labor should be very proud that it was a Labor Prime Minister that took that challenge on. Now, Keating could have let that go. He could have let that go. And it must have been very difficult for what was then an aged Labor government to take on perhaps the toughest political challenge that they'd come across. Aboriginal Affairs, native title. And we all remember the Black Hands, Minerals Council Black Hand ads. They were tough times. But Keating, to his credit, persisted, and we still reap the benefits of that today. I am very lucky. My father, who never recovered from what happened to him, never talked to me about what happened to him, couldn't talk to me about what happened to him. Our conversations were few and far between about his relationship with his mum and what had happened to him. Despite those who knew my dad knew he was a fairly robust character, but could not talk about things that I now read about, and I can only get to read about now that he's no longer with me. And the story I read of my father, and the story I read of his mum in particular, distresses me no end, but makes me incredibly proud that he was able to take that anger and dedicate his life to representing Aboriginal people all the way through, really, to the day he died. And that was, I guess, the anger of knowing that through deliberate government decisions, he had been separated from a family he could never reconnect to. He never could. And as a result, his fierce determination ensured that my sister and I got more than we could ever have wanted. Whether it be a wonderful education, whether it be wonderful opportunities, and whether it be the capacity to be able to stand on my feet in the Parliament and speak about what will be and continue to be for the next 4 years the Labor agenda in Aboriginal affairs. And that is a victory not of my dad alone, but of so many Aboriginal people. And the point I make, that for many, many, many decades, the only friends that Aboriginal people had was the trade union movement, as Richard said, all the young people, the youth. And for that, it is something, as we celebrate the Uluru Statement, and I encourage you to celebrate that statement, despite the challenges it may give some of our colleagues in Canberra. Celebrate that statement, because it will provide, I think, a real opportunity to take what happened in 1967 and turn it into something meaningful, something that does bring the Aboriginal voice very firmly into the debate around legislation that involves them. And I don't think that's something that is too difficult to ask. Thank you.